The morning mist clung to the Italian mountains like a shroud of death, and Lieutenant Colonel William Harrison knew that somewhere in those gray-veiled peaks lay one of the most formidable fortresses in human history. Monte Cassino rose before the Allied forces like a medieval nightmare made real. Its ancient monastery perched atop the rocky summit like a crown of stone, while German machine gun nests bristled from every crevice and cave below. It was January 17th, 1944, and the Allied advance up the Italian peninsula had ground to a bloody halt. General Mark Clark's Fifth Army had been battering themselves against these defenses for weeks, leaving trails of American, British, French, and Polish bodies scattered across the rocky slopes. Harrison adjusted his field glasses and peered through the morning gloom at the monastery that dominated the landscape. Saint Benedict had founded this sacred place in 529 AD, and for nearly 1,500 years, it had stood as a beacon of learning and spirituality. Now it served as an observation post for German artillery spotters, who could see every Allied movement for miles around. "Sir, the Second Corps is requesting updated intelligence on enemy positions," Sergeant Martinez reported, his breath forming white clouds in the cold mountain air. The young sergeant had been with Harrison since the landings at Salerno, and his usually steady voice carried an edge of tension that spoke volumes about what they all knew was coming. The statistics were sobering, as reported in contemporary military dispatches from the front. The German 10th Army, under the command of General Heinrich von Wiedenhoff, had transformed the entire Monte Cassino Massif into a fortress that would have impressed the engineers of ancient Rome. Every cave had been turned into a machine gun nest, every building into a strong point, every path into a killing field. Harrison lowered his binoculars and studied the tactical map spread across a makeshift table, constructed from ammunition boxes. The monastery sat at the apex of a triangle of death, with the town of Cassino spread below it like broken teeth, and the Rapido River flowing past like a moat filled with the blood of previous assaults. 3 previous attempts to take the position had failed catastrophically, with entire battalions disappearing into the meat grinder of German defensive fire. The air was thick with more than morning mist. The smell of credite, unwashed bodies, and death hung over the valley like a palpable presence. American artillery had been pounding German positions for days, but the enemy seemed to absorb the punishment like granite-absorbing raindrops. For every shell that found its mark, there seemed to be 10 more German positions that emerged from hidden bunkers and concealed fighting positions. "The French Expeditionary Corps is moving into position on our right flank," Martinez continued, consulting his notebook. "General Juin's men include Moroccan and Algerian troops who've been fighting in these mountains since the beginning. They know how to move in terrain like this." Harrison nodded grimly. The French colonial troops had already proven their worth in the savage fighting around the approaches to Cassino. Their mountain warfare experience and tactical flexibility had impressed even the most skeptical American commanders, but even their expertise seemed insufficient against the German preparations that had turned every stone into a potential grave marker. The morning sun finally began to burn through the mist, revealing the full scope of the challenge that lay ahead. Monte Cassino stood like a medieval castle transported into the age of modern warfare, its walls bristling with 20mm anti-aircraft guns turned toward ground targets, its courtyards hiding mortar positions, and its cellars sheltering enough ammunition to supply a small army. The Germans had spent months preparing for this moment, and they were ready. The earth shook beneath Captain Robert Thompson's boots as American artillery batteries unleashed their fury against the German positions scattered across the Monte Cassino Massif. It was January 24th, 1944, and the long-anticipated assault on the Gustav Line was finally beginning in earnest. Thompson commanded Bravo Company of the 36th Infantry Division, and his men were about to attempt what military historians would later call one of the most difficult river crossings in military history. The Rapido River lay before them in the pre-dawn darkness, its waters running black and swift between banks that had been transformed into killing fields by months of German preparation. Thompson checked his watch, 0300 hours. In 30 minutes, his men would begin their desperate attempt to establish a bridgehead on the far bank, while other units of the 36th Division made similar crossings up and down the river line. "Captain, the boats are ready," whispered Staff Sergeant Davis, materialized beside Thompson like a ghost in the darkness. The inflatable assault boats looked pitifully small and fragile compared to the task ahead of them. Each boat could carry perhaps 12 men, and they would have to paddle across 100 yards of open water while German machine gunners poured fire down from concealed positions. According to contemporary military records preserved in the National Archives, the German defenders had spent weeks preparing for exactly this type of assault. Every approach to the river had been pre-registered by artillery observers. Every potential crossing site had been covered by overlapping fields of fire, and underwater obstacles had been placed to channel attacking forces into predetermined killing zones. The first wave launched at 0330, with Thompson's company leading the assault in the center sector. The rubber boats slipped into the dark water with barely a splash, and for a few precious moments, it seemed as though they might achieve surprise. Then the night exploded into a hellscape of tracer bullets, mortar shells, and screaming steel that transformed the peaceful Italian countryside into a vision of mechanized apocalypse. German machine guns opened fire from positions that had remained hidden. Despite weeks of Allied reconnaissance, the distinctive sound of the MG-42 filled the air with its cloth-ripping chatter, sending streams of bullets across the water at 1,200 rounds per minute. Thompson saw the boat to his left disintegrate under the impact of multiple hits, its occupants disappearing beneath the dark waters without so much as a scream. "Keep paddling," Thompson shouted over the cacophony of battle. Though he knew his voice could barely be heard above the din of combat, his own boat was taking hits, rubber panels deflating as German bullets punched through the sides. Water began sloshing around his boots as the boat slowly lost buoyancy. But somehow they continued moving toward the far shore. The river crossing became a nightmare of epic proportions as German artillery began falling. Among the assault boats with mathematical precision, the enemy had obviously calculated exact ranges and timing sequences that allowed them to place devastating fire on the river at precisely the moments when the boats would be most vulnerable. Explosions erupted in towering columns of water and steel fragments that rained down on the survivors like deadly hail. Thompson's boat grounded on the opposite bank with a grinding scrape against stones and mud. He rolled over the gunwale into knee-deep water, his rifle held high to keep it dry, and began wading toward what appeared to be a small depression that might offer some protection from the murderous German fire. Behind him, the remainder of his company struggled ashore in small groups, many of them wounded, all of them shocked by the intensity of the defensive fire. The German position seemed to be everywhere at once. Muzzle flashes winked from the darkness like deadly fireflies, and the sound of incoming mortar rounds created a constant whistle and crash that made coordinated movement almost impossible. Thompson tried to establish radio contact with his other platoons, but the radio had been damaged during the crossing, leaving him effectively isolated on the wrong side of a river that had become a barrier between his men and any hope of reinforcement. As dawn approached and the sky began to lighten in the east, the full scope of the disaster became apparent. The 36th Division had suffered catastrophic losses in their attempt to cross the Rapido River. With entire companies wiped out in the space of a few hours, the German defensive positions had proven even more formidable than Allied intelligence had estimated, and the river itself had become a graveyard for American hopes of a quick breakthrough. Thompson looked up at the monastery of Monte Cassino, visible now in the growing light, and realized that the ancient building was probably serving as an observation post for German artillery spotters who could call down fire with pinpoint accuracy on any movement in the valley below. The strategic situation was becoming clearer by the minute, and none of it boded well for future Allied operations in this sector. The decision that would forever change the character of the Battle of Monte Cassino was made in a command bunker 20 miles behind the front lines, where General Harold Alexander studied reconnaissance photographs with the intensity of a man whose every choice carried the weight of thousands of lives. It was February 13th, 1944, and the Allied offensive had stalled completely against the impregnable German defenses that surrounded the ancient monastery. Major General Francis Tucker of the 4th Indian Division had been the first to suggest what many considered unthinkable. The monastery must be destroyed, he argued during a heated conference of Allied commanders. As long as that building stands on the summit, the Germans can observe every movement we make. Our men are being slaughtered because the enemy can see everything from that position. The debate that followed would rage through military and moral philosophy for decades to come. The monastery of Monte Cassino was not just any building. It was one of the most sacred sites in Christian Europe, the mother house of the Benedictine order, and a repository of irreplaceable manuscripts and artistic treasures that had survived the fall of Rome, the barbarian invasions, and nearly 15 centuries of European warfare. Lieutenant Colonel William Harrison found himself caught in the middle of this impossible decision. When he was summoned to provide intelligence assessments about German use of the monastery, "Sir, We have no direct evidence that the Germans are using the building itself for military purposes. He reported honestly, however, their observation posts in the vicinity provide complete visual coverage of our positions, and their artillery fire has been devastatingly accurate. The historical context, as documented in wartime intelligence reports, revealed the complexity of the situation facing Allied commanders. The German 1st Parachute Division had indeed established defensive positions throughout the Monte Cassino Massif, but they had scrupulously avoided placing weapons inside the monastery itself, respecting an informal agreement with the Vatican. However, their positions immediately adjacent to the building provided virtually the same tactical advantage, as while maintaining the technical appearance of respecting the sanctuary. General Mark Clark remained opposed to bombing the monastery, arguing that its destruction would create more problems than its assault. The rubble will provide better defensive positions for German troops than the intact building, he insisted during increasingly tense planning sessions. We'll be doing their work for them while simultaneously handing them a propaganda victory that will resonate throughout the Catholic world. But pressure was mounting from multiple directions as Allied casualties continued to mount, with each failed attempt to advance up the slopes toward the German positions. The British 8th Army had taken severe losses in their sector. The French Expeditionary Corps was reporting similar casualties, and American units were being bled white in repeated assaults that gained ground measured in yards rather than miles. On February 15th, the decision was finally made at the highest levels of Allied command. 136 B-25 Mitchell bombers and B-26 Marauders took off from airfields across southern Italy, their bomb bays loaded with over 400 tons of high explosive and incendiary bombs. The monastery that had stood for nearly 15 centuries was about to become a casualty of modern warfare. Captain James Morrison was flying in the lead formation when the ancient building came into view. Through the morning haze, target identified, he reported over the radio, though something in his voice betrayed the conflicted emotions that many of the air crews were experiencing. Below them lay not just a military objective, but a symbol of Western civilization that had preserved classical learning through the Dark Ages. The bombing began at 9:30 in the morning and continued in waves throughout the day. High explosive bombs crashed through ancient stone walls and sent towers that had stood since the 6th century tumbling into rubble. Incendiary bombs ignited manuscripts that had survived the fall of Rome, and the smoke from burning libraries rose into the Italian sky like funeral pyres for European culture itself. German troops watched from their positions scattered throughout the surrounding hills as the monastery disappeared beneath clouds of dust and smoke. Paradoxically, many of them felt a sense of loss as well, recognizing that something irreplaceable was being destroyed regardless of the military necessity that had prompted the attack. The 1st Parachute Division had maintained strict orders to respect the religious nature of the building, and now they watched helplessly as Allied bombs accomplished what centuries of warfare had never achieved. When the bombing finally ended and the dust began to settle, the ancient monastery of Monte Cassino had been reduced to a pile of rubble that would indeed provide better defensive positions for German troops than the intact building had ever offered. The Allies had succeeded in destroying one of Europe's most sacred sites, but they had not advanced their tactical situation by a single yard. The moral and strategic implications of the bombing would reverberate through the remainder of the battle and far beyond, raising questions about the price of military necessity and the responsibility of armies to preserve cultural heritage even in the midst of total war. The war-torn landscape around Monte Cassino had become a United Nations of suffering. By March 1944, as troops from across the Allied world gathered for what would become one of the most diverse military operations in the history of warfare, in the space of a few square miles, soldiers who spoke dozens of different languages and represented radically different military traditions prepared to assault the same deadly German stronghold that had already consumed thousands of their comrades. General WWII stood on a hillside overlooking the shattered remains of the monastery and felt the weight of Polish history pressing down upon him like a physical force. The 2nd Polish Corps under his command represented more than just another military unit. They were the embodiment of a nation that had been erased from the map by German and Soviet aggression, fighting for the right to exist as a free people. Many of his soldiers had been prisoners in Soviet labor camps before joining the Allied cause, and their motivation transcended normal military objectives. These men have nothing left to lose, Anders explained to British General Oliver Leese during a coordination meeting. Poland has been destroyed, their families scattered or murdered, and their homeland divided between Hitler and Stalin. For them, Monte Cassino is not just another objective. It is an opportunity to strike back at the forces that destroyed their world. The French Expeditionary Corps, commanded by General Alphonse Juin, occupied positions on the Allied right flank where the terrain was considered so difficult that the Germans had left it relatively lightly defended. Juin's force included colonial troops from Morocco and Algeria who had grown up in mountain warfare and possessed an intimate understanding of how to move and fight in the kind of vertical battlefield that Monte Cassino represented. According to military records preserved in the Service Historique de la Défense, these North African soldiers brought tactical innovations that would prove crucial in the battles to come. Their ability to move silently through rocky terrain at night, to establish observation posts in seemingly impossible positions, and to coordinate small unit actions across vast distances would complement the more conventional approaches being employed by American and British forces. The British Eighth Army, now under Lee's command following Montgomery's transfer to prepare for the Normandy invasion, included units that had been fighting in the Mediterranean theater since the beginning of the Desert Campaign. The 4th Indian Division, the 2nd New Zealand Division, and various British infantry regiments brought experience earned in the crucible of North African warfare. But even they were finding the challenges of Monte Cassino unlike anything they had previously encountered. Major Rajesh Gupta of the 4th Indian Division had participated in the successful campaigns against Italian forces in East Africa and had served with distinction during the Siege of Tobruk. This is different from desert fighting. He observed while studying German positions through field glasses. In the desert, you could maneuver, you could find flanks, you could use mobility to overcome strong positions. Here, there are no flanks. There is only the mountain, and the Germans hold the high ground. The American forces, primarily from the Fifth Army, had learned bitter lessons during their earlier attempts to cross the Rapido River and assault the German positions directly. The 34th Infantry Division, now reinforced with fresh troops and new equipment, was preparing for another attempt at the seemingly impossible task of advancing up slopes that were swept by interlocking fields of machine gun fire. Captain Robert Thompson, one of the few surviving company commanders from the original Rapido River assault, was training his replacement troops in the tactics of mountain warfare when he received word that his unit would be working in coordination with Free French forces in the upcoming offensive. The French have Moroccan troops who know mountains, his battalion commander explained. We're going to learn from them, and they're going to learn from us about coordinated fire support. The coordination between these diverse forces required a level of international military cooperation that had never been attempted on such a scale. Language barriers, different tactical doctrines, varying equipment standards, and conflicting national objectives all had to be overcome in the interest of achieving a common goal. Allied headquarters became a Tower of Babel where orders were translated into multiple languages, and tactical plans had to accommodate the strengths and limitations of forces that had trained for entirely different types of warfare. Perhaps most significantly, each national contingent brought its own reasons for fighting that went beyond the strategic objectives outlined in Allied planning documents. The Poles were fighting for national survival, the French were fighting to restore national honor, the Indians and New Zealanders were fighting for empire, the Americans were fighting to end the war as quickly as possible, and the British were fighting to maintain their position as a global power. These diverse motivations would prove to be both a source of strength and a potential weakness. As the battle intensified, the German defenders, observing this international gathering through their own intelligence networks, recognized that they were facing something unprecedented in military history. A truly global coalition united by nothing more than opposition to fascism and determination to break through the Gustav line at whatever cost might be required. The assault began at 11 o'clock on the night of May 11th, 1944, when Polish artillery batteries opened fire with a fury that seemed to concentrate all the rage of a subjugated nation into concentrated high-explosive shells. General Władysław Anders had waited months for this moment, and now his 2nd Polish Corps was finally advancing toward the shattered monastery that had become a symbol of German invincibility in Italy. Lieutenant Colonel Kazimierz Gerbiel led the 5th Krasowa Infantry Division up the treacherous slopes in darkness so complete that soldiers could barely see the man directly in front of them. These were not ordinary troops advancing into battle. They were men who had survived Soviet labor camps, watched their homeland disappear from the map, and seen their families scattered across the world by forces beyond their control. For them, Monte Cassino represented something far more significant than a tactical objective. Forward for Poland, the battle cry echoed across the mountainside in Polish, but its meaning transcended language barriers as men who had lost everything except their determination to fight pressed upward against German positions that had been strengthened continuously since the monastery's destruction 3 months earlier. The rubble that had once been St. Benedict's Abbey now sheltered German machine gun nests and mortar positions that commanded every approach to the summit. The German 1st Parachute Division had used the months since the bombing to construct an intricate defensive system among the ruins that was even more formidable than the original fortifications. Every pile of broken stone concealed a firing position. Every crater had been transformed into a strong point, and the very rubble that the Allies had created now served as perfect camouflage for weapons that could deliver devastating fire against advancing troops. Staff Sergeant Stanisław Kowalski had been a mathematics professor at the University of Krakow before the war, but now he crawled through the darkness with a Thompson submachine gun in his hands and the knowledge that he was probably going to die before sunrise. The German defensive fire was more intense than anything he had experienced during the Polish campaign of 1939 or his subsequent service with British forces in the Middle East. Contemporary military reports, as documented in the Polish Institute and Sikorsky Museum archives, describe the ferocity of the combat that developed as Polish forces closed with German positions. Throughout the night, hand-to-hand fighting erupted in the ruins of buildings that had stood for centuries, while machine gun duels between Polish and German gunners created a deadly crossfire that made movement virtually impossible for either side. The Carpathian Lancers Regiment, attacking on the Polish right flank, managed to establish a foothold in the ruins of the town below the monastery, but their advance was immediately counterattacked by German reserves who emerged from concealed bunkers like deadly apparitions. Captain Jerzy Pawlowski found himself fighting for control of a single building that changed hands 6 times during the course of the night, with neither side able to maintain possession for more than a few minutes at a time. As dawn broke on May 12th, the scope of Polish achievements became apparent despite the horrific casualties they had suffered. During the night assault, advanced elements of the 5th Kresowa Infantry Division had reached positions within 200 yards of the monastery ruins, closer than any Allied force had come since the battle began 4 months earlier. However, they were isolated, outnumbered, and under constant fire from German positions that still commanded the high ground. German counterattacks began immediately after sunrise, with Fallschirmjäger troops advancing down the slopes in small groups that used every piece of cover to approach Polish positions. The elite paratrooper units had been fighting in Italy since the Salerno landings, and they understood mountain warfare with a professionalism that had made them Hitler's most feared soldiers. Their counterattacks were methodical, coordinated, and absolutely ruthless in their execution. The battle for individual strongpoints became a series of miniature sieges, as Polish and German forces fought for control of positions that might consist of nothing more than a pile of rubble large enough to shelter a squad of infantry. Grenades flew back and forth like deadly tennis balls, while snipers on both sides picked off anyone who exposed himself for more than a few seconds at a time. By the afternoon of May 12th, Polish forces had suffered over 3,000 casualties, but they had also inflicted severe losses on the German defenders and established positions that could serve as launch points for future attacks. More importantly, they had demonstrated that the Monte Cassino fortress was not impregnable, that determined infantry could reach the summit if they were willing to pay the price in blood. Lieutenant Colonel Gerbiel, wounded twice during the night assault but still commanding his troops, radioed back to division headquarters with a message that would become part of Polish military legend: "We are holding. The enemy is weakening. Send ammunition and reinforcements, and we will take the monastery." The final phase of the Battle of Monte Cassino was about to begin, and Polish determination would prove to be the key that finally unlocked the German fortress that had defied Allied arms for 4 months. The morning of May 18th, 1944, dawned gray and misty over the Monte Cassino battlefield. But for the first time in 4 months of savage fighting, there was something different in the air that even the most battle-hardened veterans could sense. The German defensive fire that had made movement suicidal for so long was noticeably weaker, and the counterattacks that had previously driven back every Allied advance were becoming increasingly sporadic and less coordinated. Major Wilhelm Schmalz of the German 1st Parachute Division crouched in what had once been the monastery's main chapel and tried to assess the tactical situation with the objectivity that had kept him alive through 4 years of warfare. His regiment had been reduced to less than 40% strength. Ammunition was running critically low, and the supply lines that connected his isolated garrison to the main German forces had been cut by Allied advances in other sectors. "Sir, we're receiving orders to prepare for withdrawal," reported Oberfeldwebel Hermann Fischer, a veteran NCO whose uniform was torn and stained with the accumulated grime of weeks of continuous combat. The message had come through one of the few radio sets, still functioning after months of Allied artillery bombardment, and its contents represented the end of an era in German defensive strategy. The Polish Second Corps had maintained their positions on the slopes below the monastery, despite suffering casualties that would have broken less motivated troops. General Enders had rotated fresh units into the line continuously, feeding reinforcements into the battle with the methodical persistence of a man who understood that Monte Cassino represented far more than a tactical objective for the Polish nation in exile. Captain Jerzy Pawlowski led his company of Carpathian Lancers in what would prove to be the final assault on the monastery ruins. His men had been fighting for a week with minimal sleep, sustained by nothing more than determination to plant the Polish flag on the summit that had defied Allied arms for so long. The rubble-strewn approaches were littered with the bodies of both Polish and German soldiers, testament to the savage fighting that had characterized every attempt to take the position. According to wartime records preserved in the Polish Army Museum, the final assault began at dawn on May 18th with the artillery preparation. That was more symbolic than effective. Most of the German positions had been so thoroughly destroyed by months of bombardment that additional shelling served mainly to announce Allied intentions, rather than to inflict significant additional damage on the defenders. The breakthrough came not through any single dramatic action, but through the cumulative effect of months of pressure that had finally worn down German resistance beyond the point of sustainability. Polish infantry advancing up the northeastern slope discovered that several key German strongpoints had been abandoned during the night, with their defenders either killed, wounded, or withdrawn to more defensible positions closer to the summit. Lieutenant Stanisław Lipski, leading a platoon of the 12th Podolian Lancers, was among the first Allied soldiers to reach the ruins of the monastery's main building. What he found there was a scene of devastation that exceeded even the most pessimistic expectations. The ancient walls had been reduced to piles of broken stone. The courtyards were cratered by shell holes, and the entire complex looked like the surface of an alien planet, rather than one of Christianity's most sacred sites. German resistance collapsed with surprising suddenness as news spread through their ranks that withdrawal orders had been received and that maintaining the position was no longer militarily necessary. The Gustav Line had been broken in other sectors by the combined pressure of Allied offensives, and Monte Cassino had become an isolated strongpoint that could no longer serve its original strategic purpose. The French Expeditionary Corps, advancing through the mountains on the Allied right flank, had achieved the breakthrough that made continued German defense of Monte Cassino impossible. General Juin's Moroccan and Algerian troops had demonstrated that even the most difficult terrain could be penetrated by soldiers who possessed the proper training and motivation. Their advance through mountains that the Germans had considered impassable had outflanked the entire Gustav Line. At 10:30 in the morning on May 18th, a Polish patrol led by 2nd Lieutenant Kazimierz Gerbiel raised the Polish flag over the ruins of Monte Cassino Monastery. The red and white banner snapped in the mountain wind above stones that had witnessed 15 centuries of European history, and its appearance marked the end of one of the longest and bloodiest battles of the Second World War. The German withdrawal was conducted with the professional competence that had characterized their defense throughout the 4-month siege. Demolition charges destroyed remaining ammunition dumps. Booby traps were left for unwary Allied soldiers, and the retreat was covered by small rearguard actions that bought time for the main force to establish new defensive positions further north. The 1st Parachute Division had fought one of the most tenacious defensive actions in military history, and they withdrew with their military honor intact despite their ultimate defeat. The Polish flag flying over the ruins of Monte Cassino Monastery was visible for miles across the Italian countryside, and its appearance on the morning of May 18th, 1944, marked the end of one of the most grueling battles in the history of warfare. General Władysław Anders stood among the rubble that had once been St. Benedict's Abbey and felt the weight of 4 months of continuous combat finally lifting from his shoulders. Though the cost of victory was written in the faces of his surviving soldiers, the casualty figures were staggering by any measure of military accounting. The Allied forces had suffered over 55,000 casualties during the 4 battles for Monte Cassino, with the Polish Second Corps alone losing nearly 4,000 men during their final assault. The German 1st Parachute Division had been virtually destroyed as a fighting force, though their sacrifice had bought precious time for the construction of new defensive lines further north. Captain Robert Thompson, one of the few American officers to survive from the original Rapido River assault in January, walked through the ruins of the monastery with the slow, careful steps of a man who had seen too much death in too short a time. The building that had dominated the battlefield for so long was now nothing more than piles of broken stone, but somehow its destruction seemed less significant than the human cost that had been paid to achieve it. "We've opened the road to Rome," announced General Harold Alexander during a press conference held in a bombed-out building. In the valley below the monastery, the strategic implications of the Monte Cassino victory were already becoming apparent, as German forces throughout central Italy began withdrawing toward new defensive positions that could not benefit from the commanding terrain that had made the Gustav Line so formidable. The liberation of Rome followed with dramatic swiftness, as German resistance crumbled throughout the region. General Mark Clark's Fifth Army entered the Eternal City on June 4, 1944, just 2 days before the Normandy landings that would open the long-awaited Second Front in Western Europe. The psychological impact of capturing Hitler's first European capital was immense, though it was somewhat overshadowed by the larger drama unfolding in France. For the Polish soldiers who had finally taken Monte Cassino, the victory carried meanings that transcended normal military objectives. They had demonstrated that Polish arms could still triumph over German forces, that their nation's military traditions had survived the disasters of 1939, and that Poland deserved a place at the table when the post-war world was reconstructed. The red and white flag over Monte Cassino had become a symbol of national resurrection. The monastery itself would eventually be rebuilt through an international effort that sought to restore what warfare had destroyed. The Benedictine community returned to Monte Cassino in the post-war years, and the ancient walls rose again from the rubble, though they could never fully replace the irreplaceable manuscripts and artistic treasures that had been lost during the bombing of February 15th. Military historians would debate the tactical and strategic lessons of Monte Cassino for decades to come, questioning whether the battle had been necessary, whether the monastery should have been bombed, and whether the casualties had been justified by the strategic gains achieved. Had remained unquestionable was the extraordinary courage displayed by soldiers from many nations, who had faced one of the strongest defensive positions in military history and ultimately prevailed. Through sheer determination, the German defenders, despite their ultimate defeat, had fought one of the most professional defensive actions of the war. The 1st Parachute Division's stubborn resistance had delayed the Allied advance for crucial months, buying time for the construction of additional defensive lines and the preparation of forces that would contest every mile of the Allied advance toward the German homeland. Their tactical competence had been matched by their strategic understanding of the battle's larger significance. As the sun set over the Italian mountains on May 18, 1944, the Battle of Monte Cassino finally came to an end. The ancient monastery lay in ruins. Thousands of soldiers from multiple nations rested in hastily dug graves, scattered across the hillsides, and the road to Rome lay open before the advancing Allied armies. The fortress that had seemed impregnable had finally fallen, not to superior strategy or overwhelming firepower, but to the accumulated weight of human determination, applied consistently over months of savage warfare. The victory at Monte Cassino would be remembered as one of the pivotal moments of the Second World War, a battle where soldiers from around the world had united in pursuit of a common goal, and ultimately prevailed despite facing odds that had seemed insurmountable. The Polish flag flying over the ruins served as a symbol not just of national pride, but of the international cooperation that had made victory possible. In the darkest hours of the 20th century,